The wind howled across the wide, snow-covered prairie as if the night itself carried whispers of her terror, and every step she took left a trembling trail of desperation in the white frost that stretched endlessly under the moonlight. Her breath came out ragged and sharp, clouds of fear rising and vanishing into the dark as she ran, clutching at the tattered edges of her dress, stumbling through drifts that swallowed her ankles, her heart pounding not only from exhaustion, but from the cruel memory of hands that had bound her, struck her, silenced her, and sought to break her spirit. She fled because she had no choice. Because somewhere deep inside the bruises and the fatigue, the flame of survival burned too fiercely to be snuffed out. And so she braved the bitter cold, the unforgiving wilderness, and the echo of men shouting behind her, voices of cruelty that would not forgive her escape. Hours passed like lifetimes until her legs weakened and her chest felt torn apart by the chill, and at last she sank to her knees in the snow, gasping, trembling, her red hair tangled like fire against the pale wasteland, her fingers numb, her mind whispering that maybe this was where her story ended. Alone, unloved, forgotten beneath the indifferent stars. But then, as the horizon began to bleed with the faintest hint of dawn, the crunch of steady footsteps came from the east, not rushed, not cruel, but cautious and deliberate. As though the one approaching was not hunting but searching, she lifted her head weakly, her vision blurred, and saw the dark silhouette of a man framed against the golden glow that touched the sky. He wore a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, a coat dusted with frost, leather boots firm against the snow, and at his side hung the promise of steel, though the way he carried himself spoke more of protection than of violence. His eyes, when she met them, were not the harsh eyes she had fled from but steady, soft with a kind of unspoken strength, and when he crouched before her his voice came low, rough with the grit of a man who had lived through hardship but filled with a gentleness that thawed the ice in her bones. "You're safe now." The words broke something inside her, a dam of silence and fear, and she sobbed into the cold air, clutching her arms around herself, as though afraid the world might tear her apart again. He shrugged off his coat without hesitation, wrapping it around her shaking shoulders, shielding her frail frame from the biting wind, and though he did not know her name, he held her gaze as if to promise that names could come later, that what mattered was the choice he made in that instant, not to let her die, not to let her be dragged back into darkness, but to give her a chance at tomorrow. She tried to speak, but her lips trembled too violently, her voice stolen by exhaustion, and so he lifted her gently, cradling her as one might cradle something precious and fragile, and began to walk, each step measured, each stride defiant against the storm that sought to claim her. His cabin was miles away, nestled in a lonely grove where the fire still burned in the hearth, where warmth and shelter waited, and though the road was long, he carried her without complaint, his breath steady, his eyes sharp, scanning the horizon for any sign of pursuit. She drifted in and out of consciousness, her cheek pressed against the rough fabric of his vest, and in the fragments of awareness she held onto, the echo of his words, "You're safe now," as though they were an anchor pulling her away from the abyss. Time blurred, and when at last he pushed open the heavy wooden door of his cabin, the rush of warmth wrapped around them both, the glow of firelight painting his rugged features, and he laid her gently upon the bed by the flames, covering her with blankets, tending to her with hands that had known work and hardship but not cruelty. He did not press her for answers that night. He did not demand her story or pry into her wounds. Instead, he brewed a simple broth, coaxed her to sip from the cup, and when she trembled too hard to hold it, he steadied her hands with his own. She studied him through tear-blurred eyes, the lines of his face, etched with the kind of pain only solitude could carve, the shadow of a past he did not speak of, but in his presence there was no threat, only a calm assurance that if the world had been unkind, at least here, for this fragile moment, she could rest. Slowly, warmth crept back into her veins, and though nightmares lurked just beyond the edges of her weary mind, she drifted into sleep under the weight of his coat and the crackle of the fire, knowing at last that she was not alone. Outside, the wind raged and the snow thickened, covering the tracks of her flight, erasing the trail that led back to the cruelty she had escaped. And in that erasure, there was a strange kind of mercy. The cowboy sat by the fire, silent, watchful, one hand resting on the rifle propped against the wall, his gaze never leaving her frail form, as though his presence alone could stand guard against the ghosts that hunted her. He did not know her story yet, whether she had fled from a cruel master, a violent husband, or the merciless grip of some outlaw gang. But he knew enough that she was broken, that she needed safety, and that fate had placed her in his path. As dawn spread across the horizon, spilling light over the snow-blanketed prairie, he made a silent vow to himself. Whatever hands had harmed, her would not touch her again, not while he still drew breath. And though he had long lived as a solitary figure, a man whose only company had been the endless plains and the quiet hum of memory, he felt now a stirring in his chest, a sense of purpose that went beyond his own survival. She stirred once in her sleep, whispering words he could not quite hear, and he leaned forward, brushing a strand of fiery red hair from her face, murmuring softly, "Rest easy, darling. You're safe now." And perhaps in time, when her strength returned and her voice steadied, she would tell him her story. Perhaps together they would ride beyond the shadows of her past, carving out a new chapter beneath the boundless sky. For now, though, it was enough that she was alive, that she had found shelter in the storm, and that his arms had caught her before despair could claim her completely. And so the tale begins, not with triumph or laughter, but with survival, with the promise of healing, and with the quiet certainty of a cowboy's vow she would not face her demons alone. If this story touched your heart, if it carried you across the snow and into the warmth of firelight, then join us for the journey ahead. Subscribe to the channel, stay close to the fire, and be part of every tale we bring to life, where courage, hope, and love are never lost to the night.